The 12th of January, 1888, a Thursday, somewhere in Holt County, Nebraska, 19-year-old Etta Shattuck had been teaching school since morning. By mid-afternoon, the stove had burned its last stick of wood, and the storm that hit the plains that day, temperature dropping 53 degrees in under 7 hours, had turned the air outside her schoolhouse door into something that could kill a man in 12 minutes. She got her students home, then she tried to walk to her own boarding house, 40 yards away, maybe 60. She never found it. Etta Shattuck wandered in that blizzard for what investigators later estimated was somewhere near an hour. When farmer Daniel Murphy pulled her out of a haystack 2 days later, 70 hours after she'd gone missing, she was alive but barely. She lost one foot to the cold, all the toes on the other. Infection followed. She died in early February, 3 weeks after the storm ended. She couldn't cover 40 yards. Now here's the question that's haunted me since I first read her account. Not why she got lost, that part is easy, since the children's blizzard dropped visibility to near zero in minutes flat. The question that doesn't get answered in most accounts of 1,888 is this: why didn't she know how to stay warm without a building? There were men right then, in 1888, alive and still working, who had spent years out in weather far worse than the children's blizzard. Men who had trapped beaver in the Wind Rivers in January with temperatures at -40, who had slept in open sagebrush country with no shelter at all and woke up the next morning, who understood, in a way they couldn't fully put into words, exactly how cold worked, exactly what fire needed to survive in wind, and exactly how you kept yourself alive when the world turned against you. Those men had learned from people who had lived on the Great Plains for 10,000 years. And that knowledge that accumulated, tested, passed down through generations' understanding of fire and cold had not made it to Etta Shattuck's schoolroom. It had not made it to most of the settler homesteads dotting the Dakotas, Nebraska, and Kansas by the 1880s. The question is why? The answer is one of the most fascinating stories in American history, a story about who holds knowledge, how knowledge travels, and what happens when it arrives too late. Before we go any further, I want you to sit with something that doesn't make intuitive sense. The people who suffered the most in these Great Plains winters, the settlers who froze in their claim shanties, who burned their furniture for warmth, who watched their cattle suffocate in drifts, had access to iron stoves, brick chimneys, and fireplaces. They had chopped wood and stacked it. They had money and tools and draft animals. The people who had survived the same winters for centuries had none of that. No iron stove, no brick chimney, no hardware store, no backup plan involving purchasing more firewood. And yet the Mandan had a saying recorded by Lewis and Clark during their winter at Fort Mandan in 1804 that translates roughly to, "If we eat, you will eat. If we starve, you will starve." It was an offer of total solidarity, which is notable. But more notable is the fact that the Mandan themselves did not starve. They were not offering charity from poverty. They were offering from abundance, because they knew things that the Corps of Discovery 40, well-armed, government-funded American soldiers did not. That gap is what this story is about. Let's go back further, much further. The year is 1832. A British Army officer and explorer named George Frederick Ruxton is still a teenager in school, and somewhere in the wind-bitten valley of the Green River in what is now southwestern Wyoming, a United States Army captain named Benjamin Bonneville is making what his men will later call one of the great strategic miscalculations of the fur trade era. Bonneville completed his stockade on the 9th of August, 1832, a 100-foot square palisade of cut logs with 2 blockhouses, the kind of structure that looks, on paper, like competence, like preparation, like the sort of thing you'd want between yourself and a Rocky Mountain winter. His own lieutenant, Joseph Walker, looked at it and left. The free trappers who came through warned Bonneville flatly that the Green River Valley was much too cold a place to spend a winter. Bonneville didn't listen. What happened next wasn't dramatic. The fort didn't burn down or get attacked. Snow simply came early, came heavy, and came cold, and Bonneville abandoned the structure and relocated to the Salmon River in Idaho, where timber was available and the valley offered more protection from the worst winds. Mountain men called it Fort Nonsense, and some called it Bonneville's Folly. Washington Irving bought the rights to the story from Bonneville himself for $1,000 and published it in 1837. And even in Irving's sympathetic telling, you can hear the fundamental problem. A man who built a fixed structure in a place that demanded mobility had simply misread the conditions. That misreading wasn't stupidity. It was a failure of the right kind of knowledge at the right time. Here is what the right knowledge looked like. A mountain man's fire kit weighed almost nothing and fit inside his bullet pouch, a small leather bag worn on the body at all times, day and night, even while sleeping. George Frederick Ruxton, who would spend the winter of 1846-47 among trappers and document the period in his 1849 book Life in the Far West, left us the clearest single description of it. The kit held a steel striker, a C-shaped or oval piece of high-carbon steel that shaved microscopic hot particles off a flint with each blow. It held pieces of char cloth, which was cotton fabric cooked in a sealed tin until carbonized, with an ignition temperature so low that even a faint spark from the steel would set it glowing. And it held tinder, shredded dry grass or bark, shaped into what Ruxton called a nest, into which the glowing char cloth was placed, then waved until the whole bundle flared. Experienced hands could produce fire from flint and steel in 1 to 3 strikes in good conditions, 2 strikes if the char cloth was fresh and the flint was sharp. But what happened in bad conditions is the part that matters for this story. James Clyman's diaries. Clyman was a mountain man and frontiersman, active in the 1820s, contain an account that I keep coming back to. He and William Sublette were caught by a blizzard in the Wind River country of Wyoming, somewhere near present-day Lander, in open sagebrush country with no timber within riding distance. The fire they had was driven apart by the north wind before they finished their supper. They tried to rebuild it. The wind destroyed it again. They reached for their steel strikers. Their hands, exposed for just minutes, had gone so numb they couldn't feel the metal. They tried their flintlock rifles and got the same result. 2 experienced mountain men with fire kits on their bodies were unable to produce a spark. What saved them was Clyman running his hand through the ashes and finding, as he wrote in his diary, a small coal of fire, alive not larger than a grain of corn. He put it in a handful of prepared tinder. He waved it. In a minute he had a blaze. They rode 4 miles to timber. Clyman made fire immediately. Sublette was so nearly frozen that Clyman had to work over him for some time before he could stand. That single ember, smaller than a grain of corn, saved both their lives, and what it represents is not luck but discipline. The discipline to check the ashes before you assume the fire is gone, the discipline to keep tinder on your body rather than in a separate pack, and the discipline to understand that in a storm you need timber, not open country. Clyman knew all of this because he had learned it the hard way, in stages, from men who had learned it from indigenous peoples who had never had the option of learning it any other way. This is the nested nature of the knowledge we're talking about. You have to follow it inward, layer by layer, to understand what the settlers were actually missing. The outermost layer is the mountain men themselves, the trappers, the free traders, the guides. Roughly 3,000 men working in the Rocky Mountain fur trade between about 1,820 and 1,840. They look like the protagonists of this story, and in some ways they are, but they're really the middle of it. The layer inside them is the indigenous nations they learned from, not abstractly, but specifically and personally. Kit Carson married into Arapaho and Cheyenne communities. Jim Bridger spoke Shoshone, Blackfoot, and Flathead fluently enough to negotiate and trade. James Beckworth spent 6 years among the Crow and was eventually adopted as a chief. These weren't brief encounters. They were immersive enough that the knowledge flowed both ways, though the settlers almost never acknowledged which direction the most critical knowledge had originally traveled. And the layer inside that, the source, is 10,000 years of continuous inhabitation of some of the coldest, most hostile territory on the continent. The Mandan Earth Lodge, the Lakota Teepee, the Dakota Fire Hole, the Pawnee Smoke and Draft System, these weren't folk solutions to a weather problem. They were engineering, the product of generations of observation, modification, and testing, refined until they worked with the climate rather than against it. Let's talk about how a tipi actually works in a blizzard. because this is where the settlers and the mountain men diverged most sharply from each other. The open hearth fireplace in a log cabin, the settlers' primary heat source, operated at somewhere between 5 and 15% thermal efficiency. The other 85 to 95% of the heat went up the chimney, and this is not a small design flaw. The EPA confirmed in modern testing that most traditional fireplaces lose over 90% of their fire's heat through the flue, and the draft created by that chimney pulls heated room air out along with the smoke. In a serious storm, a large open hearth fireplace could be actively cooling the cabin it was meant to warm. The teepee solved this problem through a design so elegant, it took European engineers until the late 20th century to fully appreciate it. The Lakota and other plains peoples had refined the conical skin lodge over centuries. The structure is not a perfect cone. It tilts backward into the prevailing wind, with a steeper rear slope that sheds gusts and a slightly oval base positioned to push the structure into the ground under wind pressure rather than lift it. The entrance faces east, away from the prevailing westerly and northwesterly winds that define Great Plains weather. At the top, 2 adjustable flaps called smoke flaps or ears, each controlled by a pole, pivot to keep the smoke hole quartering downwind regardless of wind direction. When the wind shifts in the night, someone adjusts the poles, the smoke hole stays open, the draft stays consistent, and the fire burns. But the real engineering, the part most observers missed, is the interior dew cloth, a curtain of hide or canvas hung from the poles about 6 feet off the ground, extending to the floor and weighted down. The outer cover of the tipi is staked slightly off the ground. This creates a narrow channel between the outer cover and the dew cloth. Cold outside air is drawn under the outer cover, travels upward through this channel, reaches the top of the teepee, and exits through the smoke hole. The fire at the center pulls this air continuously through convection. The living space inside the dew cloth is insulated from the cold liner, warmed by a central fire whose radiant heat reaches every person sitting around it equally, and ventilated by a constant, gentle current of fresh air that the chimney effect sustains without any mechanical assistance. Reginald and Gladys Laubin, who spent years living in teepees and published The Indian Teepee in 1957, wrote that someone had described the teepee as living inside a chimney, but that in practice, with the liner correctly installed and a good fire, the structure was not merely warm. In a plains blizzard, it was genuinely comfortable. The mountain men figured this out, not all of them and not immediately, but the ones who survived long enough to become guides had generally spent enough time in skin lodges with indigenous communities to understand that the fireplace was a flawed technology and the teepee was not. The settlers, mostly, had not spent that time. They arrived with their European assumptions about what proper shelter looked like, and those assumptions killed people in numbers the Great Plains had never seen before. Here is a specific piece of fire knowledge that took generations to develop and almost no time to lose. The Dakota fire hole works like this. 2 holes are dug in the earth, connected by an underground tunnel. One hole is the fire chamber, where the fire burns. The other hole is the air intake, positioned upwind of the fire chamber. Hot combustion gases rise from the fire and exit through the open top of the first hole. That rising air creates a pressure differential, which pulls fresh oxygen-rich air down through the intake hole, through the tunnel, and up into the fire. The result is a fire that burns hotter than an open campfire, produces almost no smoke, is nearly invisible from a distance, which was critical for people who needed to hunt without being seen, and is wind-resistant in a way that a surface fire is not. When the wind picks up, more air is forced down the intake, more oxygen reaches the fire, and combustion improves rather than failing. The fire doesn't go out in a storm. The storm feeds it. Early trappers who worked alongside Dakota hunters learned this. Some of them taught it to guides, and some of those guides taught it to trail parties. Captain Randolph Marcy's The Prairie Traveler, published by the U.S. War Department in 1859, included a version of this technique by which point it had already been understood by indigenous peoples for centuries and practiced by mountain men for decades. By 1888, when Etta Shattuck's stove ran out of wood, You could find The Prairie Traveler at most frontier outfitters. But knowing a book exists and having read it carefully enough to put its lessons into practice in a blizzard are not the same thing. The hard winter of 1880-81 gave the settlers their first real lesson, and most of them didn't read it. A blizzard hit southeastern Dakota Territory on the 15th of October, 1880, and it didn't stop. Storms came one after another from October through April, dropping temperatures to -35 degrees Fahrenheit and building drifts in the railroad cuts 40 feet deep. Rail service was suspended completely from late December until late April. Towns were cut off from coal, from food, from any resupply at all. In De Smet, Dakota Territory, a settlement of about 80 people, a teenage girl named Laura Ingalls was watching her father's hands. A fiddle player's hands go swollen and cracked from twisting hay into tight bundles to burn for heat. They had already burned the furniture. The coal was gone. The wood was gone. The hay twisted into sticks burned so fast that maintaining any warmth required someone working constantly, barely stopping to eat. What Laura Ingalls recorded in the long winter, 4 decades later, was the experience of intelligent, resourceful people. Her father was a skilled carpenter, a farmer, a man who could do most anything, discovering that the frontier winter required a category of knowledge they simply didn't possess. They survived. Almanzo Wilder and Cap Garland drove a horse-drawn sled roughly 12 miles into open prairie in the middle of winter to buy 60 bushels of wheat from a settler named Robert Boast, which kept the town from starving. The trains returned on the 30th of April, 1881. But the fundamental question, how do you maintain a livable temperature without running out of fuel, was never answered by the winter of 1880-81. It was answered, for those who knew to look, by what the mountain men had carried forward from the people who'd lived on the plains for millennia. Bank your fire at night so the coals survive until morning. Don't build your fire in the open, but find or build a windbreak. Know your fuel's burn characteristics before the storm comes, rather than during it. And never assume that the ash pile is empty. Let's pause on that last principle, because it's the specific thing that most settler accounts get wrong. Ash insulates, which is not obvious unless you've experienced it. A pile of ash over hot coals acts as a thermal blanket. Ash has very low thermal conductivity, which means the heat inside moves outward extremely slowly. Properly covered coals can survive 8 to 12 hours in an open fire pit. Mountain men banking their fires before sleep were not performing a ritual. They were preserving a resource that would cost significant time and cold exposure to replace. James Kleiman found a coal the size of a grain of corn in a pile of ash that appeared completely dead. The coal was alive because ash had covered it, possibly deliberately, possibly by the wind scattering ash over the coals as the fire died. The result was the same. Heat had survived in a hostile environment. The settlers who were losing their fires in the children's blizzard weren't losing them because fire is fragile. Fire, managed correctly, is remarkably persistent. They were losing them because they didn't know how to manage it under the specific conditions they were facing, because that knowledge had lived in communities they had never engaged with, carried by men who had moved mostly off the trail systems by the time the Great Settlement wave came through. The settler generation and the mountain man generation barely overlapped, and that is the core of the tragedy. The peak of the fur trade was roughly 1820 to 1840. By the late 1830s, the beaver market was collapsing. European fashion had moved from beaver felt hats to silk, and the mountain man as a viable economic category was already disappearing. The great rendezvous on the Green River, where trappers, traders, and indigenous peoples gathered each summer to exchange goods and knowledge, ended in 1840. The first large emigrant wagon trains to Oregon and California left in 1841. Thomas Fitzpatrick, Broken Hand, one of the most experienced mountain men alive, guided the Bidwell-Bartleson Party, the first organized wagon train to California that year. Kit Carson guided John C. Fremont's mapping expeditions in 1842, 1843, 44, and 1845. Jim Bridger built Fort Bridger on the Trail Corridor in 1843, where emigrants could resupply and, if they paid attention, absorb some of what he knew. This was the window, a narrow decade in the early 1840s, when experienced mountain men were actively guiding emigrant parties, and the knowledge transfer could have happened on a large scale. It happened on a small scale instead. The immigrants who crossed with Fitzpatrick, Carson, Bridger, and the handful of other experienced guides, those specific people, on those specific trains, got the benefit of decades of accumulated knowledge condensed into a single season of travel. They learned buffalo chip fires from watching the practice, not from reading about it. Helen Carpenter, in her 1856 diary, described settlers crossing the plains with bag in hand, gathering chips for the evening meal, a technique that would have been bizarre to any of them before the journey, and that was simply part of life by its end. But the settlers who came 10 or 20 years later, in the 1860s and 1870s and 1880s, came without guides. The trail was established, the army had mapped it, Captain Marcy's handbook existed, and there were posts and forts. You didn't need a mountain man anymore, or so the thinking went. What you actually lost when you stopped requiring a mountain man was not directions. You lost the lived understanding of what cold does to fire, and what fire requires from the person tending it when the temperature falls faster than you've ever seen it fall before. The great die-up of 1886-87 demonstrated the full cost of that lost knowledge, though it did so to cattle rather than people, which is perhaps why it didn't produce the same immediate cultural reckoning. The winter of 1886-87 began with a dry summer that left northern range grasses sparse and short. Cattle went into winter underfed, with insufficient body fat. Then, on the 9th of January, 1887, a blizzard hit 16 inches of snow in 16 hours. Temperatures at -46 in most of the northern ranges and -63 in some locations. An early precipitation had fallen as sleet, creating an ice crust over the grass, which meant the cattle that didn't die in the storm couldn't reach food underneath, even when the storm lifted. An estimated 60 to 90% of northern range cattle died. Theodore Roosevelt, whose ranches in the Dakotas were devastated, wrote to Henry Cabot Lodge, "Well, we have had a perfect smash-up all through the cattle country of the Northwest." Tax rolls in Custer County, Montana showed 200 ranchers in 1886 and only 120 by 1888. The open-range cattle era was functionally over. What nobody wrote in the accounts of 1886-87 is that the Lakota, the Mandan, the Hidatsa, and other nations who had managed livestock and winter food on the same plains had done so for centuries without losing 60 to 90% of their animals to a single storm. Not because those winters weren't as bad, they were, but because the management strategies those nations had developed over generations accounted for exactly the kind of sustained cold that European American ranchers were encountering as a surprise. The knowledge existed. It was not consulted. By 1886, the systematic effort to move indigenous peoples off the land and onto reservations was well advanced, and the knowledge those peoples held about managing life in that specific climate was not being transferred to the settlers who replaced them. It was being suppressed along with the people who held it. The 12th of January, 1888. We're back at the beginning. The temperature at one weather station in the Dakotas was 40 degrees Fahrenheit at 2 in the afternoon. By 9 that evening, it was -11. The wind hit 60 miles per hour. The front meteorologists would later calculate moved 780 miles in 17 hours, which is a rate of advance that made it genuinely impossible to forecast with the instruments and communication systems of 1888. About 235 people died, and the majority were children. Lois Royce was 19 years old, teaching school in Plainview, Nebraska. By 3 in the afternoon, her stove was out of fuel. She had 3 students left: 9-year-old Peter Poggensee, 9-year-old Otto Rosberg, and 6-year-old Hattie Rosberg. Her boarding house was less than 100 yards away. In the whiteout, with wind from the northwest at sustained speeds that witnesses described as solid noise rather than sound, she could not find it. She walked with her students until she couldn't walk, and then she stayed with them. Peter died around 6 in the evening, Otto around midnight. Hattie, the 6-year-old, survived until daylight, murmuring against her teacher's coat. Lois Royce survived, but she lost both feet. About 40 miles away, Minnie Freeman, also 19, also a teacher, watched the storm pull the roof off her sod schoolhouse entirely. She gathered 13 students and walked them roughly a mile and a half to her boarding house through the open storm. All 13 survived. The difference between these two stories is not courage or competence, since both women showed extraordinary courage. The difference is circumstance, and the difference in circumstance comes down to fuel. Royce ran out of fuel, and when she ran out of fuel, she had no structure and no warmth, and when she had no warmth, she was in the open, in a storm, at -40 with 60-mile-per-hour wind, in clothing designed for a warm January morning. What would a mountain man have done in Lois Royce's schoolroom at 3 in the afternoon? Not what Royce did not, through any fault of hers, but because the options a mountain man would have recognized require knowing things she had no reason to know. The mountain man's first principle in any situation involving fire and cold is that fire is a resource to be preserved, not assumed. You don't let your fire go out if you can help it. You bank it when it's low. You add fuel before it's urgent. You never reach the point where the choice is between no fire and stepping outside into a blizzard. Royce's schoolhouse had a stove, and stoves require fuel to be physically present and accessible. When the fuel is gone, the stove is an iron box. Mountain men, by contrast, carried their fire-making capability on their bodies, and they had fuel strategies that didn't depend on a prepared supply, running out cleanly before the emergency began. Buffalo chips are one example. Every schoolhouse on the Nebraska and Dakota plains was surrounded by prairie that, a decade earlier, had been home to millions of bison. By 1888, the bison were gone, but cattle had replaced them. Dried cattle dung, functionally equivalent to bison chips as a fuel, was available on virtually every homestead, burning at somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000 BTU per pound and producing steady heat with little flame. The Oregon Trail emigrants had learned this. The next generation of settlers, arriving after the main trail era, often had not. Sod is another example. The walls of a sod house or sod schoolhouse were, in extremis, burnable not efficiently, not pleasantly. Since sod burns slowly and smoky and smells terrible, but it burns. A mountain man in a crisis was not sentimental about building materials. And most importantly, the mountain man's response to running low on fuel in a storm was not to wait until the fuel was gone and then act. It was to act while fuel remained, bank the fire, reduce the burn rate, cut heat loss, and buy time. Cutting heat loss is the piece that connects the teepee, the earth lodge, the Dakota fire hole, and the buffalo chip fire into a single coherent philosophy of winter fire management. The relevant question is never just how to make more heat, it's always how to keep the heat you're already making. Because on the open plains in January, the gap between those two questions can be the difference between survival and death. A teepee answers this by having a central fire whose radiant heat reaches all occupants simultaneously, an interior liner that traps warm air in the living space, and a chimney effect that clears smoke without losing significant warmth. The fire doesn't have to be large, it has to be positioned and surrounded correctly. A Mandan earth lodge answers this by burying half the structure in the ground, earth being an extraordinary insulator, and by building the fire under a smoke hole that the lodge's own geometry makes into a passive draft system. The lodge's large mass takes a long time to cool, and even after the fire dies, the structure holds heat for hours. A mountain man's camp shelter, a reflector fire setup, as described by Rufus Sage in Rocky Mountain Life in 1846, answers this by building a wall of green logs behind the fire that absorbs heat slowly and re-radiates it toward the shelter, essentially functioning as a thermal battery. The fire burns half as much wood to maintain the same effective temperature on the occupant's side. None of these solutions required materials that a Nebraska schoolteacher didn't have access to. The reflector principle could have been built from the sod itself or from desks. The earth insulation principle was already present in every sod structure on the plains. But the application, knowing why these things work, not just that they work, was the knowledge that hadn't arrived. Let's go back to the original question. the one that opened this story. Why didn't Etta Shattuck know how to stay warm without a building? The answer isn't that nobody knew. The answer is that the people who knew were not in a position to teach her, and the systems that might have transmitted that knowledge had broken down in the generation before she was born. The mountain men who carried the knowledge left trail guiding by the early 1850s. Some of their students, the emigrants they'd guided, carried pieces of it forward. But the knowledge was embodied. It lived in practice, in habit, in the automatic response of a man who'd been cold enough times to have the right instincts. It was hard to write down fully, and the Prairie Traveler, which did write some of it down, arrived in most homes as a reference book rather than a survival education. The indigenous nations who had developed the knowledge in the first place were being removed from the land that defined what the knowledge was for. Their fire management techniques were adapted specifically to the Great Plains, to its winds, its fuel sources, its temperature patterns, its specific variety of blizzard. That specificity was the knowledge's greatest strength and, in the context of forced removal and cultural suppression, its greatest vulnerability. You couldn't fully transfer knowledge about the Green River Valley's winter winds to someone who was never going to live in the Green River Valley. And the settlers came fast, came in waves, came with the confidence of people who had survived winters before Eastern winters, European winters, and didn't fully understand that the Great Plains had invented a new category of bad weather that their previous experience hadn't prepared them for. There's a figure in this story who tried to close the gap, and I want to spend a moment with him because he represents the knowledge transfer at its most deliberate. Thomas Broken Hand Fitzpatrick was born in Ireland around 1799. He came to the United States as a teenager, made his way west, and by the early 1820s was operating as a trapper in the Rocky Mountain fur trade. He learned the mountains from the Shoshone and the Crow. He learned fire from people who had never not known how to make it. By the 1840s, Fitzpatrick had become the most trusted guide on the emigrant trails. He led the Whitman Spalding Missionary Party in 1836. Narcissa Whitman and Eliza Spalding became, with his help, the first European-American women to cross the Continental Divide. He led the Bidwell-Bartleson Party in 1841. He guided Army exploration parties and diplomatic delegations to indigenous nations for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. What Fitzpatrick knew, after 30 years in the mountains and on the plains, was comprehensive, not just fire, though fire was fundamental, but water, food, weather reading, wound treatment, horse management, and the 100 other disciplines that determined whether a party of emigrants arrived where they were going or died trying. When John C. Fremont later took a fourth expedition into the Colorado Rockies in 1848 without Fitzpatrick or Carson, choosing instead a guide named Bill Williams who was experienced but not at Fitzpatrick's level, 11 of the 34 men died. Williams himself died the following spring trying to recover the abandoned equipment. Fitzpatrick died in Washington in 1854, aged 55, while negotiating on behalf of the Arapaho and Cheyenne peoples he'd spent his life among. He never wrote a comprehensive guide to winter survival. That knowledge lived in him and died with him to whatever extent it hadn't been passed to the emigrants he'd led. The children's blizzard killed about 235 people in a single afternoon and evening, but the knowledge gap it exposed had been accumulating for decades, and the storms that preceded it 1,880-81, 1,886-87, and others before those had been offering the same lesson in installments. The settlers who survived those winters, the ones who came through with families intact and livestock alive, had generally done one or more of three things. They had stockpiled fuel before winter arrived, not what they thought they'd need, but dramatically more than that. They had built shelters with lower heat loss, either by design or by accident: sod construction, earth berming, deep-set windows, anything that reduced the gap between inside and outside temperatures. And they had modified their fire management to be active rather than passive, not building fires and assuming they'd stay lit, but banking, tending, and preserving through the night. These are exactly the practices that the mountain men had learned from the nations who had understood them for centuries. They arrived at the settler generation through observation, through the prairie traveler, through whatever fragments of advice crossed between experienced homesteaders and new arrivals. Some settlers got them. Many didn't. Seymour Dopp, a schoolteacher in Pawnee City, Nebraska, survived the children's blizzard with his students because he had stockpiled wood. That's the entire explanation. He had done what the mountain men would have called basic preparation. He had thought about his fuel before the storm came, not during it. By the 1890s, the lesson was spreading in ways it hadn't before, partly because the children's blizzard produced such vivid, specific accounts from survivors that it was impossible to treat as simply bad luck. David Laskin, who wrote The Children's Blizzard in 2004, documented how survivor testimony from 1,888 circulated in newspapers across the plains. What happened, exactly when, to exactly whom. That specificity forced settlers to confront not just that a storm could be deadly, but why. And the answers almost always came back to fuel, shelter quality, and fire management. The irony is that by the time this lesson was broadly absorbed, by the time Great Plains settlers were routinely stockpiling more fuel, building tighter structures, and learning to read the signs of a fast-moving Arctic front, the mountain men who had known it longest were mostly gone, and the indigenous nations who had invented it were living under conditions that made the transfer of that knowledge a political act rather than a natural one. What survived was practice without complete understanding. The settler generation learned to prepare for storms. They didn't always understand exactly why their grandfathers' cabins had been so cold that the fireplace was the problem as much as the solution, or why a teepee in a blizzard was warmer than a log house with a roaring fire. They just knew, from bitter experience, to have more wood than they thought they'd need. There's a coda to this story that I keep thinking about. The Lakota word for their seasonal fire, the fire at the center of the teepee, is peta, and the person responsible for maintaining it, called the firekeeper, had a specific role that went beyond just adding fuel. The firekeeper understood the draft, understood how the smoke flap poles needed to be adjusted as the wind shifted, and understood when the fire needed to be banked and when it needed more air. The job was a full-time attention requirement, not a task you did when you remembered. The settlers who survived the worst winters on the Great Plains developed something like this understanding, though they rarely named it or framed it that way. They kept someone assigned to the fire through the night. They banked it carefully before sleeping. They knew by then that fire was the one thing you couldn't let slip your attention for, even an hour in the worst of it. That is a very old understanding, older than the United States, older than the fur trade, older than the first European contact with the continent. It took the settlers roughly a generation of catastrophic loss to arrive at something the Mandan had encoded into their architecture, the Lakota into their social roles, and the mountain men into their instincts. The knowledge traveled a long, hard, expensive road, and not everyone along that road got far enough to survive. Etta Shattuck died in early February 1888. Minnie Freeman, who led 13 children through the same storm and lost none of them, was celebrated as a hero. She received over 80 marriage proposals after newspaper accounts of her walk ran across the country. Both women were 19 years old. Both were teaching on the Nebraska plains. Both met the same storm on the same afternoon. The difference between their stories in every specific I can find is that Freeman's schoolhouse held its structure long enough for her to make a decision and move, while Royce's schoolhouse lost its fuel supply and gave her no option at all. But the deeper difference, the one that the mountain men and the Lakota and the Mandan would have recognized immediately, is that neither woman had the knowledge that might have kept them both alive, regardless of their specific circumstances. That knowledge existed. It had existed for thousands of years on the very ground they were standing on. It just hadn't made it there in time. Compartilhar conteúdo do projeto man montane criado por vos how mountain men. Avoid these styles. These styles were used. TXT 317 Linhast XT.